I'm usually talking to university audiences who really don't know much about working locally, so that's kind of what I preach, and you all already do it, a lot of you. So in any case, I apologize for reading it, but you're really lucky I do, because I wander madly otherwise. And my favorite part of talking is the discussion afterwards, so I hope we can really have a discussion afterwards. So somebody's going to have to deal with the slides, and they go pretty fast, John, so we'll see now. Apparently this doesn't like American slides. I'm trying to take that not personally or politically. And they can go right ahead. You know. Or do you want me to hold on to one of those things and you could hold on to the other? They're both at the same time. So let's see if we can get this over a little. This is where I live in New Mexico, which is in the southwest of the United States. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. That's good. And if you could keep them focused, because I'm up here. This thing. Anyway, that's my house. And that, you see, we have a different kind of abandoned houses around there made of adobe, which is mud, basically. Don't have all this lovely rock. Anyway, I call this talk ground level, because I'm going to talk as much about the cultural landscape as I will about art. I could have called it ripple effects, because I've come to feel that a strong land-based art like activism starts precisely from ground level, from a center, a specific location, a kind of deep map from consciously lived experience. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. And then it moves on out from there via whatever audience it's able to pick up in other circles and so forth. The relations between doing and seeing, action and vision, construction and perception lie at the core of landscape experience. Next, again, the term cultural landscape is a way of thinking about art and landscape issues that was pretty well invented by J.B. Jackson, who was a peripatetic scholar based in New Mexico, who defined landscape as, quote, a concrete three-dimensional shared reality, a collaboration between people and nature rather than idealized picture or view, something out there. In urban locations, the geography may be harder to see, but the city, too, offers endless clues to the social history of land use. The photograph on the left is by Edward Ranney, who lives in New Mexico but was raised in Chicago, and it's the Des Plaines River ship channel in Chicago. The one on the right is by Blaise Tobiah. It's in Detroit, and it's the old Highland Park State Bank, which is now an adult movies theater. Change of land use. It's called Pillars of the Community. He did a series of these. It's dangerous to forget that cities are, I think I said that, the cities are actually vital parts of their regions, and they interlock with everything else surrounding them. One way to get the picture is to kind of move out from your neighborhood, your city, in different radiuses, looking around as you go. I know that understanding my own place in a larger place helps me understand my place in the world, the ripple effect again. Next one. These are by Jane Greengold. I think this one on the right could be focused a little bit. She did this in the New York subway, scenic overlook ahead. And as you walk along, you see a view that is in a Brooklyn Park when you get up out of the subway, when you go overground. There are any number of ways artists can think about and work at ground level. The obvious one is landscape painting, which I love to look at, but don't always find intellectually provocative. It resembles the scenic overlook in some ways, where we're asked to look at a view chosen for us rather than see and observe for ourselves. Photography is subject to the same pitfalls, but has other attributes that make it a kind of public art, which I'll get into later. Next. Land or art, or earth art, which began in the late 1960s, is usually site-specific but not place-specific. It's really a mostly urban art, taking place in and borrowing the power of rural places. Lynn Hall, who's based in Wyoming and Colorado, has called her hydroglyphs on the left, which are quite small carvings in the rock meant for wildlife watering in an arid climate. And the one on the right, of course, is Bob Smithson's spiral jetty, which is probably the best known earthwork in the world. It's a huge thing in Salt Lake in Utah, and it's constructed, as you see, totally constructed. It's now underwater, but it's still quite fascinating because it colors the water, and the water is changing it. So it's really a collaboration with nature in a way. But Lynn Hall has called her hydroglyphs the inverse of Smithson's spiral jetty, a small-scale, nurturing, feminine gesture on the landscape. So what's now being called eco-art, often devoted to reclamation, is another way of interacting with nature and culture. And then there's a new kind of environmental conceptual art, which is embedded in electronic media, and these are just very random examples of that. The one on the left is by a couple named Suzanne Bloom and Ed Hill, who work out of Texas, and they call themselves Manual as a collaboration. They do some fascinating, very layered, sophisticated stuff about digitally. And so if you look at this, you find all kinds of stories. This is post-industrial landscape, #1. There's the guy cutting down trees in the background. There's the cleared lot. There's the deck made of wood, and they deal a lot with wood and water and how we use them. The one on the right is by Patrick Nagatani, who works in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this is the ground zero at the Trinity site where the first atom bomb was tested. And it's called Trinitite. Next. Art that focuses our attention on one part of the landscape by becoming a landmark is another way to intervene. The one on the left is by Klaus Oldenburg. It's a giant horseshoe in Texas, in Marfa, Texas. And the one on the right is called Snake Bench. It's by the Chicago Public Art Group. Phil Schuster did this, but it's a great, wonderful snake that goes on and on. And then there's place-specific art, which is really my focus. Actually, I like to do place-specific lectures, but I got to Sherkin for the first time yesterday, so it'd be kind of presumptuous to go on about that. I have, however, taken a lot of tourist snapshots today. So next, please. Place-specific art is often public art, but not just anything plunked down where people can see it. A place-specific art cares about challenges, involves, and consults the audience for or with whom it's made, respecting community and environment. Place-specific public artists are becoming pretty savvy about city planning and rural land use, working in reclaimed landfills, gravel pits, or sewer treatment plants. In fact, all of us concerned with the intersection of art and nature and social issues today really have to know the bedrock, the traffic patterns, the demography, politics and power structures, land use laws, zoning, and so forth. The one on the right is by Laurie Lundquist and Jean Quick-to-See Smith. Jean is a Salish Native American. And this was a plan for a kind of wonderful thing called, did that just go off? Yeah. Bugsy's Cafe for a wastewater treatment plant in Phoenix, Arizona. This did not get built. It was too clever. And the one on the left is by Meryl Laderman Euclides, who's most famous as the honorary sanitation commissioner in New York City for about 20 years now. She started voluntarily just as an artist working with what she called maintenance art. She went from changing her kids' diapers to, she was an artist, and then she had these kids, and she said, well, oh God, I'm not going to be able to be an artist anymore. I'm spending all my time doing this stuff. So she thought, why not make this stuff into the art that I'm making? So she started in the home, then started washing down museum floors, then she went to giant businesses and asked people to think of 10 minutes of their work every day as art. And people just, the workers who were cleaning the places, it's all about maintenance work, were just fascinated, you know, which 10 minutes were they going to think of as art today, and so forth. It really kind of revved them up. And then she went on to work with the sanitation department. She shook the hand of every single so-called garbage man in the city of New York. And some of them were literally in tears when she was doing this because people kicked them off the porches, and it's not like it was their garbage, it's our garbage, but people were really horrid to sanitation workers. And she kind of humanized the whole process and went on to make ballets with giant bulldozers that handle trash, and works at huge landfill. She works very large scale now, but this is in a landfill thing on the Hudson River in New York City. And I'd better stop talking so much about the slides, or we will never get through this. Or then next, or questions of like, where does your water come from? A friend in an arid state put a map of the water system over her sink to remind her how far her water had to come and how precious it is. I know this isn't your problem now, but as Liam said, where we come from, we're in a terrible drought. Reservoirs are at about 20%. We've had 1 inch of rain so far this year through June. So this is a book called The Book of Drought, made this year by Basia Ireland, who is an artist in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Next, please. If location, location, location is the real estate industry's mating call, place-specific artists need to think context, context, context. Where is this art going to be made? Why and for whom? Will it be decoration, entertainment, monument, participant? What is its role in the landscape? The nature and heritage trails that are getting more popular in the U.S., and I suspect here too, often leave much to be desired in terms of depth and inclusivity, but they're potentially great ideas, allowing newcomers to share a place's past and to identify with whatever parts of that past ring a bell or touch a chord with their own lives. These are two artists who have been working that way. Richard Mills on the left, a series of nature plaques kind of along the Greenway, along the Hackensack River in New Jersey. And the one on the right is by Ruth Wallen, and this is the agriculture part. It's a series called Viewpoints, where she gives you a Claude lens. I'm not going to be real clear about what a Claude lens is, but it does something funny. It distorts the landscape, sort of, and then she talks about that. So that's the kind of art component there. Next. Temporary work, because it's cheaper and sometimes less controversial, if only because it's going to go away sooner, can involve a different set of values. It can be kind of funkier, closer to the ground, more political, more embroiled with local cultures, and it can be riskier too. Public artists need to take risks though, and then to admit to and learn from each other's mistakes. If a work's more collectively executed, the more people there are going to be to educate their friends and relatives and to share the blame, and marshal defenders if there's a battle, and there so often is around public art. The one on the left is by a Cheyenne Native American, Edgar Heap of Birds, and it's about how the rest of the so-called white people took land from the native people in the U.S. And what he always puts the name of the place backwards, as though to make the place look backwards and to turn things around and say, okay, today your host is, and the host is always the native tribe that owned the land originally, from whom it was stolen generally. The one on the right is called The Tell. It's by Jerry Birchfield and Mark Chamberlain in Laguna Beach, California, Laguna Canyon, California. This whole wall echoes the mountains behind it, and every single picture is every one of these little things is a local photograph. The people brought in their own photographs, and it was to fight a development of this beautiful little canyon that everybody was very fond of, and that was about to be totally developed. And this was partly successful, this huge campaign they did, primarily with photography as the tool. But this mountain of plywood covered with local photographs, I think is really wonderful. And it's called The Tell because it tells the story of the place from the point of view of people living there. Next. It's even possible that public art about nature won't be fully effective until it's really integrated into and perhaps even disappears into culture and nature itself. Good ecological art, which works in and with the landscape, comes in a lot of guises, but some of the best is virtually invisible, like conceptual art was in the 1960s. Yet this goes totally against the grain of an international art world that runs on high visibility, planned obsolescence, and immediate gratification, emotional and financial. Ecological artists face challenges unlike other public artists because they have to deal creatively with science and political reality and much stronger opposition than they'd find in an aesthetics-driven art world. The one on the left is actually, this reminds me of this landscape. It's an island off Maine called Vinyl Haven. It's a fishing, farming island. And this artist moved there 10 years ago and spent 10 years making a piece called Ghost Nets, in which she almost invisibly reclaims a granite quarry and a sort of destroyed bit of coastline. There's really almost nothing to see, but when you know that and when you see the framework she puts as an artist around it, if she shows this piece or I'm showing a slide or something, then it's suddenly framed as art. This one is The Great Cleansing of the Rio Grande by Dominique Mazot, who's a French artist living in Santa Fe. And she just goes out and cleans. I mean, there's been a lot of work like this over the last 30, 40 years even, of artists just going by. When we were walking over here just now, we were behind somebody who stopped and picked up some trash. You know, all you have to do is say, well, that's my artwork for today, and it is. Okay, next. I have a big thing about places. They're major influences in my life, and I fall for them faster and less conditionally than I do for people. And at the moment, I'm having a two-night stand with Sherkin Island. Yet in this multi-centered society where we all move so much and remember so little, love of place reflects a compelling tension, even a conflict. between around here and out there, regional and national, home and others' homes, memory and reality. The politics of place is layered with emotional and aesthetic resonance that's better expressed within a circle than on a line. Around here is a circular radiating motion or notion, and out there is a line of sight, the view. So this is out there. It's photographed by Bob Dawson. It's a pipe containing all of San Francisco's water on its long, long way from the source. And the one on the left is by Houston Conwell, African-American artist based in New York, but this was done in Charleston, South Carolina, in which he traces as a spiral the cultural geography of black people living there. It's more complicated than that. Next. Most North Americans have a really restless history in current life, and I don't know if there's less deracination in Ireland. We could talk about that later. I'm interested in how population can take responsibility, even temporarily, for where we find ourselves and how regionalism is affected by mobility. Making art in and for a small community demands a level of patience and generosity that's not taught in art schools. Place is the common ground between artist and audience. A real sense of place is a virtual immersion that depends on both lived experience and on a topographical intimacy that's really very rare today. Walking around and looking around and talking to people, hearing stories, that's how you learn to read a place and how you learn what you can do to help heal its wounds. There's a lot to learn from and about any place if we're really there for however long a time or short a time. A landscape, what we see when we look out there, is a layered record of what's happened over time, but travel's the only context in which some people ever look around. If we spent half the energy looking at our own neighborhoods and comparing our bits of knowledge with our neighbors' fragments, we'd probably learn twice as much and come up with a plan, maybe a whole, not accessible any other way. These are just about travel. This one on the right is a complicated installation by Diller and Scofidio, who work mostly with architecture, called Tourism's Suitcase Studies in 1992. It was a very stunning installation with a lot of big suitcases and stories inside and multimedia stuff. One on the left is a simple photograph by Meridel Rubenstein, who lives, again, in Santa Fe or around Santa Fe. And it's the way she was photographing places was taking the various parts of it with the people as the center. At that point. The one on the left is by Sherry Galkey, collaborating with a lot of school kids. It's called LA River Project. And it's multiple videos, but it is based on work that the school kids did cleaning the river in the LA River, which is just a hideous cement channel. It's not anything you'd think of as a river anymore. And the one on the right is my community newsletter from Galisteo, New Mexico, of which I am the founding editor. It's one of my proudest accomplishments. So we're all tourists in our own places. We have shallow roots in the U.S. Displacement is as important as place, exile is as important as roots, and homelessness, it should be, as important as home. Yet to a greater or lesser degree, everybody wants to know where they belong, and at the very least where they are at the moment. Even if we can locate ourselves, too few of us examine our actual relationship to that place from a personal, an ecological, and a socially critical perspective. Some people belong in a place after 2 years, and there are others who don't belong after 25 years. When people move to a place they've only visited before with any hope or illusion of staying there, they often get interested in their predecessors. It's kind of like marrying into a family. Having lost or been displaced from our own history, we're often ready to adopt those of others, or at best to be a prime audience for their stories, which is what I do in this newsletter partly. This may or may not be appropriate or courteous behavior. It's a delicate balance. If place is defined by memory, but no one with memories is left to bring them to the surface, does a place become no place? Next. Living rurally after an urban lifetime, which I do, gives one a very different perspective on all of this, and rather a lonely one when it comes to public art. Overall, the art market has become such an urban phenomenon that ignorance of rural lives and issues is just taken for granted. Yet rural gentrification is changing the face of the Western U.S. as did much of its predecessors and its facilitators, like the railroad and the automobile. Again, I don't know about Ireland, but it certainly happened in England. And I'm sorry this slide is almost invisible, but I lived in Devon for a year in the late 70s on a farm, and I went back there last year, and it is totally gentrified. This was a working farm. Now it's called Ye Olde Barn something, Ye Olde Stone Barn. All the barns have been made into second homes. There's a tennis court where the slurry pit was. That was particularly interesting. Anyway, and this is in New Mexico where the same thing is happening, and I know it's happening on Sherkin as well, but it sounds like you've got a grip on it here anyway, which I don't think we do in New Mexico. This is right down the road from where I live. But what happens in all of these places is that richer people replace poorer people who sell their land so they can afford to stay in their home places, or who have to move on because they can no longer afford to live in their home places. Taxes is one major problem. No matter how well-intentioned the newcomers may be, we are part of a destructive process, and we have too many opinions, or too many options to have the same relationship to place as a land-based people with few options. Guilt, of course, is useless, while mutual responsibility for a meaningful coexistence is really crucial. This is a piece called Fence Line Artifact by Sherry Wiggins, Jim Logan, and Buster Simpson, right at the Denver International Airport, which is a relatively new airport in the last few years. And the new airport replaced a lot of ranches and farms. And so what they did was make a big public piece that commemorated those ranches and farms. And it's called Fence Line Art. They bought up from the farms all the old machinery, old farm machinery, and they made a kind of a double avenue of farm machinery. Then they made these birdhouses that were based on the houses that were replaced next. And then this is one of the houses that was taken down, and the birdhouse would replace it, and then there were plaques telling about the history of that place, the families, which is probably illegible at this point. Anyway. A lot of us would really love to reclaim our public spaces from corporate monotony, from ogling tourists, from gentrifying agents, but the economic power of development and of civic pride or boosterism is hard to get a grip on if we don't know what we think ourselves, if we don't know how to think for ourselves. We watch our places change and we feel like powerless bystanders, but we're changing our places too. By being curious and paying attention, we gain the power that comes with knowing what we want. No place is static. The outreaching arts need to change along with the place, but on the basis of knowledge of the place. The one on the left is Mark Brest van Kampen, and it was a piece called Living from the Land. This is real ground level. He went out and for a period of time just lived from the land in California, and that was dinner one night. And the one on the right, Another Way of Knowing, is by Amina Robinson, an African-American artist from Ohio. It's a series of textile pieces called Memory Maps, in which she traces I don't know if you can read this, but it says Oakwood Alley, B.J. Blair, Ice, Small Streets, like what she remembers from her childhood neighborhood. Most so-called regional artists aren't land-based so much as connected to their places by choice, landscape-based maybe. If they look around, and alas, plenty of artists really don't look around at their environments, but if they do, they begin to be influenced by the place. It seeps into their work. In this day and age, those artists who like where they are and make work about it are inevitably put on the defensive. They're called, this is in the States, I don't know what happens here, they're called parochial and out of touch with the grand international trends. Given the commercial art world's antipathy to anything specific, regionalism is often denied its place in art. But regionalism can give an artist ground to stand on and something to say about it, enviable in the shifting sands of the art markets. Good local art has both roots and reach. Regionalism can really be an advantage rather than limitation when outside ideas and influences aren't excluded but are sifted through a local filter instead of vice versa. Next. A reconceived regional art might set up a counterpoint between lived space, recalled space, and natural space, all of which should be in quotes, I guess. It can expose the layers of emotional and aesthetic resonance in our relationships to place, tell the disparate stories about the intersection of land and lives. But so far, this view of regional art is mostly pie in the sky. There's several artists living in my village in northern New Mexico. Most of them are Anglos, that is, white people. Actually, black people are also called Anglos in New Mexico. It's anybody who is not Hispanic. White people from elsewhere. rather than native, indigenous, or Spanish-speaking people who make up a big chunk of the state's population. A couple of the local artists are very well known. A few show in classic galleries. Some make, I just say this first, this is by Harmony Hammond, who was an old friend of mine who moved there and is why I live there. It's a great big piece based on the feeling of the land there and old metal. This is an old metal, like a trough. What do you call them? A trough, but a long trough. Things that she finds on the land, remnants of farms and things that were there before. So it kind of is a sort of abstract commemoration of the land itself. This is obviously a much more realistic one by another artist in the village called Woody Gwynn, who's very well known. This is just the view out from the village. It's mostly ranch land. Next. And these are both by Jean Anaya Moya, who is a local whose family's been there for generations and so on. And these are straw applique religious pieces. And she just started doing this a few years ago, and she's gotten really good at it and quite successful. They're very beautiful things. This is all done by straw that's glued onto the wood. So some of them make jewelry or retablos or tin work or photographs that can be postcards. And while all of these people would say they love their place, and a lot of them know a lot about it, the fact remains that their art really doesn't reflect directly the place they love and live in. There's a lot of landscape art being made for export in New Mexico, but not a whole lot of art with anything specific to say about the landscape and what's becoming of it. Next. In addition, there's little or no support in the U.S. for artists who'd actually like to be more integrated into their communities, especially their rural communities, and especially as artists who want to participate in the infrastructure, who want to mess with environmental issues and may tread on property rights, God forbid. It's particularly difficult in a country with no articulated cultural policy, even more so now. To change the power relations inherent in the ways art and public spaces are now made and distributed, we need to continue to seek out new forms buried in social energies not yet recognized as art. This is a piece from years ago in New York, in Harlem, which is the African-American neighborhood, by an African-American artist named Lorraine O'Grady. An African-American Irish artist named Lorraine O'Grady. And this was a float, and it says, art is ... And it was a float for the African-American parade going through Harlem. And the point of it was a lot of her artist friends were standing on the thing with frames, and they would jump off and just stick the frame in front of the people as they went by. The idea being that wherever you live and whoever around, that's as good a subject for art as anyone else. And that art does not have to be just this and just that. I've always loved this piece because of that. The one on the right is I think, a very beautiful rock installation. See sort of rows of rocks in Tacopa, Nevada. We just happened to run across this, but it's on a much more expansive scale, and this is just sort of like either non-art or somebody's garden or outsider art. It doesn't really make any difference what it is. It's not a great slide, but it was kind of a beautiful piece. Okay, next. This on the left is by Masami Hayashi. It's the Tule Lake Relocation Camp, which is one of the concentration camps the United States government put Japanese Americans into during the Second World War, a hideous part of our history that was never taught in schools and was actually barely known till the last 20 years or so. And this one on the right is by Drex Brooks. It's from a group of series or a book called Sweet Medicine, in which he went to massacre sites of Native people in the States and commemorated what they were, just documented what they are now. So here's this nice picture of a colonist and an Indian hand in hand, sort of shaking hands, and actually is a massacre site. The photography is the one relatively inexpensive portable public art that's become a crucial record of our understanding of place, both local and foreign. And I was looking at that, what's his name, Farnell? A very nice book on Sherkin Island. It also reflects both past and present. I'm particularly fond of photography because it operates in that gap between art and life where I kind of like to hang out. A camera is a good translator of landscape issues because, for better or worse, people seem to believe photographs, even at this time of docudramas and computer illusion as reality, not to mention media hype and hypocrisy. We connect with photographic images as participants in our own lives. Good public art also connects to daily life. Still, art is a framing device for visual or social experience. So it's difficult even for photographic art forms to dispense altogether with the frame or to change frames on the spot, offering a set of multiple views of the ways a space or place can be or is used. And these slides don't have a whole hell of a lot to do with this. Wanted to show them. These are both by Navajo artists. The one on the left is by Hulia Tsinajani, and it talks about how the Navajo feel about having other things come into their spaces. And the one on the right is by Melanie Yazzie, Laura Shirley, and Ken Yazzie when they were graduate students at the University of Colorado. And there were actually 3 of these things. These are the sort of image of Navajo you see as you go along the highways. And they're also those things where you stick your head through and become whatever's there. And so you could do that. I have a picture, unfortunately, of me being forced to do that. But behind each one of these, as you look through them, you see an actual portrait of the artist, overlaid, it was an acrylic photograph, overlaid on a map of the part of the reservation that they come from. And the point of this is really 3 layers of reality, the stereotypical silly reality of Navajo, then the real person who you might meet and see, and then where the real person's heart is, which is the land that they come from. The one on the left is by Richard Mizrak. It's Swamp and Pipeline in Louisiana, east bank of the Mississippi. The one on the right is by Wanda Hammerbeck, called The Vulnerability of Desert Space, Incorrectly Perceived as Empty. That's a lovely photo. Like photography, the local is really all about specificity. As anthropologist Jim Ferris has pointed out, before film was invented, local culture was always simultaneously consumed, never recorded, rendered static, or preserved. Its presentations were not representations. End of the quote. But today we're stuck with representations. A lot of environmentally concerned photographers have struggled with the problem of the beauty of ugliness, and Richard Mizrak is well known for that, like colorful polluted waters or sculpturally destroyed land or picturesque poverty. Many believe that beauty can powerfully convey difficult ideas by engaging people when they might otherwise look away, and others accuse photographers like these of aestheticizing wounds on the land. Those who choose beauty are most effective when they're also aware of the flip side, when their choice of beauty is a conscious means to counter brutality. Places in transition are fertile ground for artists. This is a photograph by Terry Evans of the Mexico-United States border. And the one on the left is by Charles Simmons. It was something done in the 70s at Art Park on the Niagara River, and he excavated the remains of an old railway tunnel and made ritual cairns down below and made a dwelling place for a new civilization or an old civilization or whatever. On that is sort of representing that kind of transition. An awful lot has been written about the sense of place and the spirit of place, which are symbiotically related to a sense of displacement as well as to the notion of belonging and longing to belong. I'm ambivalent about these phrases even as I'm touched by them. The elders in my village talk about patria chica, one's own little country. The sense or spirit of place has become not just a cliche, but a kind of intellectual property, a way for outsiders to appropriate a place, momentarily or as long as it's convenient. Ideally, there should be no stigma attached to being adaptable or feeling most at home in someone else's home. But given the history of the West, and this I'm talking about the Western United States, and the West in general, such an emotion becomes alarmingly proprietary. At the same time, a sensitivity to place is a valuable social and cultural tool, providing much-needed connections to what we call nature, and sometimes to cultures not our own. There's also a lot of talk about listening to the river and listening to the trees, listening to our inner selves, which is all very well, but listening to other people seems equally important, whether or not we agree with them, because that's who we have to deal with to conserve what we care about, and activism in a closet is useless. Local life is all about communicating across borders. Questions of audience for a work of art raise the question of who's part of the dialogue, who's isolated or provincial or out of it. These are just 2 pieces. I love the billboard pieces by Rigo. He only goes by one name, a Portuguese background artist who lives in San Francisco. And it also points out that these things are invisible in an urban culture. Next. One of the most important things I've learned from watching community artists at work over the years is how difficult it is to accept places and people as they are, and to distinguish between the flaws that contribute to their character and the flaws that may destroy them. It's like a relationship. Even if or when everybody doesn't agree, the arts can sometimes help people make up their own minds about community planning and land use, development, open space, and so forth. The community arts are most effective as catalysts, and the results are inevitably unpredictable. Few works are likely to be popular everywhere, or even simply tolerated by everyone. Sometimes just labeling or rearranging familiar elements in the public domain can bring out their true character. Monuments that have become invisible over the years can be put in a different context or recontextualized on site and then suddenly pop back into public view. That's what these two slides are about. The one on the left is in my village. It's the remains of the first church in the village, which is just a mound of rubble, and nobody would ever know it was the first church in the village, except that one old guy painted a picture of it and put a cross up and painted a little picture of, there is one photograph of it. And it's on the mound. It makes that mound into a monument to that church, which is really very sweet, and people are not going to forget that. His name is Tony Anaya. He also put the painting on an old real estate sign, which I see as conscious or unconscious irony. And the one on the right is by a Native American artist named Charlene Teeters, who's Seattle, or Spokane. And this was a monument is a monument right in the middle of the Santa Fe Plaza. And it said something about to commemorate those who, died fighting the savage Indians. And needless to say, Indians do not like to be called savages. So somebody came along one day, and nobody to this date knows who it was. Nobody's ever bragged about it. There are all kinds of ideas about who. But this was years ago. Came along and simply, in work clothes, plaza was full of people, just chiseled out the word savage and took it away. So anyway, this became very famous, and Charlene commemorated that act by rebuilding the monument out of adobe brick and putting it right outside the state capitol as part of an art show, and with only the word savage on it. So you had to know a fair amount about Santa Fe history to get this, but it was a wonderful piece. Next. Most places are collages of different times and cultures and circumstances. The one on the right is the classic example of that. Gloria Bornstein in Seattle made this piece called Shore Viewpoints, which is much more complicated than it seems here, but she right next to the sort of historical markers that usually mark things that somewhat falsely or ignoring entirely the concerns of one part of the community or culture. So she countered it with another, with a batch of signs of her own. And this was about the Duwamish Indians who lived there, who are still not recognized federally, but exist. At most places, even look-alike subdivisions are layered and diverse from the inside. I've always wondered, what if those subdivisions and trailer parks had their own community museums and traded displays with other kinds of museums, a kind of cross-class museology. Pretty interesting. One on the left is a piece by Ian Baxter, who called himself, he and Ingrid Baxter called themselves the N.E. Thing Company, N.E. Thing Company in Vancouver, Canada. And this was just stop viewing suburbia. In other words, suburbia is not something that people want to look at. This is not interesting to people, even though a great many people live in suburbia. Would be something that would be interesting to look at. So that was about taking off on the sort of art world or general world's snobbish view of suburbia. We also have to understand the differences and the connections between urban, suburban, and working rural cultures, between the notions of wilderness as autonomous or renewable habitat, as a place for recreation, mixed uses, entertainment, or profit. And what better mirror for all these facets than art? Yet artists in the U.S., anyway, have long been trained to concentrate on the way places look rather than the way they are. Public artists are too often the decorators of outdoor living rooms. Bioregional and ecological components are often omitted from community arts campaigns. Without a sense of place and knowledge of local cultural conditions, public art is just a generalization, and generalizations float. They can't take root. Next. There's a piece called by Andrea Callard in New York years ago, late 70s, it's a seed machine for the ailanthus, which is a tree that will grow almost any place and was one of the few trees that could grow in the cement in New York vacant lots and so on. So she was handing people seeds and telling people to buy these seeds. I think you put a quarter in. The one on the right is by Deborah O'Grady, another O'Grady, Finding Susanna's Place, Finding Susanna's Well, which is part of a large multimedia thing called Talking Lake, about a small town in California. So in cultural terms, landscapes only come alive to us, in fact, only become places when they're seen, focused upon, when they become as specific to humans as they are to the other creatures that live there. Psychologist Tony Hiss asks us to actually measure our closeness to neighbors and community. He suggests ways to develop an experiential watchfulness over our region's sweet spots or favorite places. Sounds downright erotic, and I think it can be. Seeing how a place changes at different times of day, week, and year can stimulate local activism, he says. What kind of changes do you see, hear, smell, or touch that would damage our sense of connectedness to these landscapes? End of quote. And these last two slides are just, I just had fun with the idea. They're both advertisements. This one says, "You are the American landscape," which as a feminist annoys hell out of me. And the one on the left is, you know, sunset and clouds. It's sort of classic. That's what we're heading for, I think. So it's questions like these that evoke the ground level I'm talking about. Nature writer Rick Bass has suggested that the activist is the artist's ashes, emerging from the pure into the impure. But I prefer to think of artists as phoenixes arising not from the ashes of their own aspirations, but from the ashes of an obsolete definition of the artist. Oh, that's it. Thanks. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so what about you all? I'll wait a minute. I'm one of those people who can never ask a question from the audience, so I sympathize, but it is fun to hear where you're coming from. It doesn't have to be a question. I don't have the answers. So. Yeah.
I'm quite intrigued by this notion of different kind of depths of interpretation, or that kind of sense of space or place, should I say. And I was struck when I was in Oklahoma of some people introducing themselves as 2.5 American Indian, and went to the Cowboy Hall of Fame to look for histories of tribes, looking for the tribes that found it hard to find. It just occurred to me again, looking at the work, and wondering, do you find the Native American work, given the kind of sense of space and depth of history and connectedness that they have, had a different kind of resonance to it, to as you say, more transient populations of...
Well, that's interesting, because we were just talking about this the other night, last night. It's land-based people who are truly land-based, and I assume some of you in the room are from Sherkin and are truly land-based and have been here for a long time and are working the land and so forth. I think look at landscape, which is already a sort of artificial way of looking at land, in a very different way than artists and the newcomers or just people who've never been to that place before and so on do. And so Native American, it's partly a matter of sort of almost taking it for granted, but also a matter of knowing it so well and looking for different things in it than we do if we're just looking at a superficial definition of the place. And Native people, even though they've been moved, hauled off from their originally native places, I think it's hard to find Native American landscape photography and landscape painting. There was a show several years ago that I wrote part of the catalog for called Our Land Ourselves, meaning what that Navajo piece I showed was about, that we are the land, and they often, most tribes, people will say that. But coming now, I mean, the work I'm showing here is by people who've been to art school, who are more aware of making their point in the larger society. But when it comes down to working within your own society, there isn't really a need for landscape art in a curious way. I mean, if that makes any sense. So. And they haven't really been, I mean, a lot of people have been cut off from their history, as have everybody in a way, but Native people, as long as they do know they're 2.5%, whatever, do know where to go home to. And often the first question Native people ask each other is like, where are you from? And it doesn't mean, oh, I'm living in New York now. It means, where are you really from? I mean, even if maybe you've never even been there, it still has a meaning, the where are you from. So it's, and the same with the Hispano people I live among. They don't, I mean, even place names, I've been making a pest of myself asking older people about place names and stuff, and it strikes them as, why would I want to know? I'm not herding sheep there. I mean, wouldn't do me any good to know what the place names are, and they're not sure they can remember what it was and where I'm talking. I mean, I have a terrible time explaining what I'm talking about when I'm trying to point out, you know, the hill that's over behind that hill, behind this hill, and it's interesting. I mean, there's a big gap between the way somebody like me sees the landscape, even though I'm aware of these issues, and people who really are land-based see it. Answer.
I get the feeling, well, as an artist, that sometimes in Ireland one gets asphyxiated with these history face, you know, and that in a way I think a lot of Irish artists have found a new kind of way of Ireland by being put from Ireland.
Yeah.
And that it's just intriguing that, you know, it's hard to know what to do. Do you stay and find a sort of a really strong context, or do you move to be able to have that sense of otherness?
Or do you do both and then maybe come back with a different take on things? I think that's what led to Nigenia, the Navajo woman I showed, the dam, there goes the neighborhood one. She's gone off from art school and so forth, but she still has a place on the reservation and is very attached to it, and is bringing this kind of work back. And Native American, there's this particular sense of humor, and it's a large part of the culture, and I think that people would get a kick out of that on both sides of the fence. And in other words, and I mean, the rest of us get it, and so does everybody.
There's an interesting Irish film just opened in Dublin. I don't know if it's opened around the country, but again, it deals with that exact theme of landscape by the filmmaker Johnny Dolan, called Mapmaker, recommended to anybody and everyone here. But it essentially deals with the border territories between the Republic and the North of Ireland, and what it looks at is an outsider who was commissioned to come in and make a tourist map, and during the process of wandering around the landscape, he stumbles on a body, which is obviously related to the Troubles. And in order to identify the whole history, it's actually caught up with the naming of the landscape and the different communities that live on and share the same.
Oh, sounds wonderful.
Names. It's not as obvious as it might be where you have a Native American and Hispanic and a white population, because here, to all intents and purposes, outwardly, they're all the same. And you're just talking about two different Christian populations with a slightly different history. But it's really intriguing because it is got that, it's tied up with that whole area of naming, and how by naming something you then begin to control it, which also then has resonance.
Exactly.
With translations, Brian Freed's play, which is all about naming as well, and various other.
Yeah, naming is one of the fascinating, I mean, place names I find absolutely fascinating, just how, and we were talking about, Burr and I were talking about place names here and how many of them have been changed from the Irish, or whether they've been translated from the Irish, whether the Irish has been replaced. I mean, it's the same kind of thing in the States, where Indian names were brought back to New England, which was one of the first places settled after, about 200 years of history. And then they were brought back as kind of almost, in quotes, because people like them. And then you have a state of Wyoming is named after a valley in Pennsylvania. It has absolutely, it's an Indian name, but it has nothing to do with the Indians who lived in Wyoming. So there are all kinds of really strange. See that film? Is it on video? It won't get to Santa Fe, I bet. I mean, like, yeah. Well, it's happened. so now we know what happens. Well, I'm one of those people who's done that. So when I started writing on place, I didn't know there was a massive literature about place. I had no idea because my field had been art, more or less, or politics or whatever, and I just had never done that reading. And so I thought, I started teaching a seminar every now and then on place, and got really fascinated by it and thought I was breaking new ground and so forth. And then I started reading the literature and realized that that I wasn't breaking new ground. There were all these millions of books, and I mean, I'd read the sort of naturalist kind of sense of place books, but I didn't know there was many about the kind of things I was talking about. But also how much it was being, you know, exploited. But by that time I was too deep in it to get out, or I thought I was. But and also I didn't know there was a field called cultural geography, which I have since. Then I sat in on a class on cultural geography and found out what that was and started reading about that. And it's, I mean, I'm still writing from a base of horrendous ignorance, and I'm still fascinated by the subject and constantly finding things that I haven't read and don't know about. But it is a queasy balance. I mean, you know, that it's like who owns the sense of the sort of proprietary thing. I mean, when friends come to visit me in Galisteo where I live, you know, I take them around town, I show them this and I show them that, and you know, and that is a proprietary gesture. You know, it's becoming I call it my village sometimes, and so forth, you know. And I've been living there less than 10 years, so. Yeah, well, I mean, I think in a sense, I mean, because I realized that when I first started talking about this, somebody leapt up from the audience and says, what if you hate your place? What if terrible things happen to you in your place? You know, and accused me very justifiably of being really sentimental about this stuff. So I changed my tune a little bit on that. But I still sort of believe, and maybe this is making excuses for myself, but that, you know, what I said about some people belong to a place after a couple of years and some don't belong after 25 years. And some belong after 3 generations, but they hate it, and so forth. So there's just so many nuances, which is what makes the subject so interesting. I mean, it would be real interesting to take a poll of everybody in the audience and you know, find out where do you think you belong, or, you know, and it can be a place that you don't belong in terms of historical placement and so on. But then there is all this business of, you know, taking it away from the people who live there, and who often it is literally taken away because of people who are land rich and cash poor, which is the story of so many places, and other people coming in. And I mean, you can. I mean, I have a feeling you could tell me some more about that. Yeah. And I mean, one way to explore it to me is finding out what other people think. I mean, it opens up a huge amount of other ways of looking at places. Yeah.
Maybe just kind of that piece from the Island Federation. A very strong theme there, and it's natural in societies and community that, you know, that you have people coming in and going, and that's very natural. I think the area you did is when it's not organic, you know, when you take over and you actually kill what you come to value. Right?
The bridge syndrome, they call it. You want to be the last one to move in. You don't want anybody else to be there. Then.
And oddly enough here, in fact, another thing you mentioned there, and I've lived in Scotland myself, you know, as well as living in the west of Ireland and working on the island, and certainly observed that pattern of the outsider who assimilated very naturally, very easily, and even those assimilated outsiders refer to the others as settlers, you know, the ones who didn't assimilate either. But what's interesting there is, I think, it really all comes down, and not standing to be looking at this from an artist point of view, but it really all comes down to real local democracy in a way. You know, if the people have control, be it the outside and the inside, you know. You know, just to give you an example from this country, and I was really taken with the example you gave there of the birdhouse. Really, from the perspective, you know, even with the best of lack of analysis. They haven't done, in a way, they haven't done their analysis properly, and are actually making proposals that would actually describe a very rich heritage and attachment to it. So I just make that point that what you're showing there is certainly stimulating me, and it's certainly a strong key. As it would, I think, this is universal.
Yeah, it's surprising how there's a group called the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which for once I didn't show. I usually use their slides on everything, but and they talk about deleted communities, which is and what they do is they do sort of studies of land use, but they do it in a very deadpan way. They may show you like photographs of, I don't know, fire guard towers or mom and pop caves or those places behind huge chain link fences, and you don't know what goes on back there. There's just a sign that says "Do not enter." Turns out to be they're making plutonium triggers or something. I mean, we usually know where those are being made, but to some extent. But that kind of thing where they really interpret the landscape, and they'll come into an area and sort of do that by driving around and seeing, well, what's that? Nobody knows what that is. Okay, that's one of our places, and then they go in and do the research and tell you more or less what it is. But deleted communities is one of their, which I like that phrase. I mean, I don't like it, but it's places where communities have just been overwhelmed or disappeared or whatever.
I was just wondering if art, as we know it, is a and if, and it's interesting when you say that life is art, and if in the past when people were much more connected, that it is much more intrinsic, and it's only because we don't have that connection now that we feel we need to.
That we make pictures of the land. That's a really interesting. I hadn't thought of it quite that way. That may well be. I don't have anything. I think there are all multiple places for art, and lest you should think I hate paintings and stuff, which every now and then I get interpreted this way. I don't. I think, galleries, museums are fine. I just wish there were more going on outside of all of that, and the kind of work that I'm in. Everybody talks about that, so I'm talking about this other stuff that happens more outside of the galleries. But it's true that art has become a distancing process, and people. I once got very interested in, never really did much about it, but I wondered what farmers' wives decorated their living rooms with. Whether pictures of, and often farms don't have, it's that land-based thing again, don't have picture windows and stuff, and don't have big pictures of that landscape. They often have pictures of a different landscape. Like I know people in Maine they have southwestern pictures, or they might have an autumn landscape where they don't live in a place where the leaves turn, or a nice old farm and water wheel, or whatever, red barn and water wheel, when they don't live in that area. But that represents some kind of really abstract nostalgia that it's there, that everybody. Yeah, and how far out women. Yeah. So we're running down. They're making food back there. Okay. Yeah, that's. No, that's a real hard question because it just is. Obviously, it's what I've done all my life. Who knows why you become an art critic? Certainly not for the money, but I wanted to write novels. It turned out I wasn't very good at that, and I ended up by getting totally involved in writing about art. Partly because I like writing about things that are impossible to write about, because you can never really translate the visual into words. So it's kind of fun working in that place where you're unsuccessful one way or another. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really an art critic anymore and haven't been for quite a long time. I mean, I don't sit in front of a painting and say there should be more red in the upper left-hand corner or whatever. I mean, I did that briefly in the 60s, in the early mid-60s, and it didn't sustain me, so I got off onto using art, and I do use art in a sense, and artists. And friends hit me with this now and then, but for the issues and the content and the subject matter that I get interested in, then I look around and see what artists are, and often it's the artist that stimulates that interest in the content. But so I'm just a sort of, I guess, middle person. I mean, catalyst. I don't think most art criticism, I have to say, and one reason I stopped doing that kind of thing, I don't think it turns people on to art a whole lot. I mean, there is a small intellectual constituency for really looking, and it can be fun to write that stuff, really looking at art in a very, very detailed way, and it interests only a very small community. And that, I didn't want to interest only a very small community. When I found my parents, who were college educated and intelligent people who read a lot and looked at a lot of art too, did not understand what I was writing. I thought, whoops, it's time to get out of this. Because I could tell it was getting narrower and narrower and narrower. Only my best friends knew what I was talking about. And the artists who I was writing about didn't often know what I was talking about either. Like, what is this? But who knows what the art... I mean, I think there is art criticism has actually in some ways gotten a lot more interesting since I started it, because it used to be so formalist. And since I started writing art criticism, I think there's more broad looks at stuff now. And cultural critics, I get called a cultural critic now, whatever that means. But kind of a postmodern thing. Was there? Yeah.
Yes, actually there is a role for advocacy.
Yes, yes.
And we have something like supporting how the value.
Yeah, for that word, because I used to call myself an advocacy critic, I mean, whatever that is. But
I just wondered how you thought the way ahead, how you saw the task of creating that powerful.
I never really thought about it. I mean, I've never been. I don't make decisions. I always say they just sort of happen to me. But I just kind of go along, and somebody sparks some interest, and I'm grab at it and run with it or whatever. I have no claim to being sort of prophetic or anything. People used to say, oh, how did you know this was going to happen or something? And I didn't. I went to studios. Artists were the people I've learned everything about art that I know from. And that's where it's happening, is in the studios. And so if you keep an eye on what's going on in the studios, then sooner or later, I mean, I'm not in the studios anymore because I live so far away from a lot of studios. But that is the way you find out what's happening, is the artists themselves. Then I always want to push artists further than they want to go. That's one of the problems.
You started out as an artist yourself. I was wondering, do you think it's possible to do both, like be an artist?
I didn't start out as an artist. No, I was always a writer. I've worked with conceptual artists off and on because conceptual art was so close to writing criticism that we could mush the two together, but I never called myself an artist. But I do think you can do both. A lot of them, in fact, I think some of the best art critics have been artists. Ad Reinhardt, I don't know if these names are familiar to you here, but these are people that I learned a tremendous amount from. Ad Reinhardt, Robert Smithson. Less women, for some reason, do that, and I'm not sure what that's about. I've never been able to figure. I always find when I'm giving these lists, I give mostly men, and there are not many women who are artists who are also critics, and that may be partly because I've always said, and I think it's still true, but it certainly was 30 years ago or so, that women were more acceptable in positions of taking care of art, which was made by men, which art was the primary thing. And so it was much easier for a man to be an artist and a woman to be the caretaker of the art, which is the critic, the curator, the collector, whatever. And I'm not sure that's entirely gone yet. And I think a lot of women who might have been artists have sort of ended up being writers. I was not one of them. I'm a terrible artist. But I definitely think it's possible to do both. I mean, nobody knows more about art than people who are making it. So go for it if you're thinking of it or if you're already doing it. Yeah.
I would like to go back to one of the slides you were showing. There was a memory wall in California. I think that there was all these little photographs of people.
Oh, the tell, yeah.
Yeah, and I just, because it's such a strong image, it stayed with me, even with the sky, those little the white clouds, and how the curve was and the color. And this obviously is a piece of landscape art that is or it looked to me like it fit into place, it's a strong image, and it's rooted in a place if it takes up local history. And so it's very important for landscape artists to really not to impose, but to kind of bring it in, to bring it from the landscape, let it grow from there and fit it into the surrounding. Because when I think of even if I loved it, I love this image, but to think of something similar being here on Sherkin, I would hate it. Because here I love the nothingness, to look at.
Well, this was a temporary piece, and it was a protest piece. I mean, it happens to be a beautiful work of art as well as being an effective protest, but that was taken down. I mean, it did eventually go, yeah, because it was put up there to remind people. I mean, as I say, it echoed the contour of the mountains behind it, and it was meant to be part of the landscape, show how the people's lives there were part of the landscape. I mean, everything you said, but it didn't last, and I agree. I mean, I wouldn't want to see it in my landscape either.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I think for outsiders, when you're not connected to the landscape, you can love it in that place. When I look at this, I think this is perfect. But when you live there, it probably isn't. If you disturb from your...
No, this was only a protest against the people who were going to change the place and take it away from the people. So I don't know how long it lasted. I don't think it was a huge amount of time, a few months maybe.
So you would say landscape art should really only be temporary, passing through? Or?
Well, no, I think they vary. No, it's different in every context. Again, context for me means a huge amount. I mean, if somebody put that up, even if it was a very clever, ironic billboard of the landscape, which has been done, the landscape of Sherkin, and there's a billboard of exactly what you would see behind it if the landscape weren't there. I mean, if the billboard weren't there, that's interesting, and in certain cases it means something, but it would not be wonderful if it just popped up because some artist thought, well, I own this land, so I'll make that there. And this does happen a lot. I mean, I think there's some pretty terrible public art and pretty terrible art in local stuff too. But sometimes what I think is of as terrible art is something that local people really wanted to see there and they love it. And at that point, it's not my business to run around, whining about it isn't good enough art or whatever. So, should we eat?
On behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you, Lippard, and I'd also like to thank the Jolly Roger. I know you did because they're in food and they're responsible for it. So thank you all. Thank you.